Speaking broadly, across all of these areas in which there is a very large divide between Trump and Biden supporters, what is the likelihood that that divide narrows in coming years? Is it possible that Americans will become less divided or reach something closer to a consensus?
So asking to predict the future is something that we try to steer away from at Pew Research Center. I don't want to speculate about what might be coming down the road. I will say, of course, it's possible, but I do think that what our report shows is that there are some very fundamental divides on a lot of these issues. When you look at something like gun rights, for example, where for years we've tracked a very strong partisan divide, and where today something or in the neighborhood of 80% of Biden supporters say that gun ownership makes Americans less safe, whereas something like 80% of Trump supporters say it makes them more safe, it increases safety. Um, I don't see that divide necessarily disappearing overnight. It's something where there seems to be a major issue that cuts to the core of political values and that people seem to have genuinely differing beliefs about.
So, stark divides on guns, on abortion, on racial attitudes, on the legacy of slavery, on immigration. Is there any area in which Americans agree?
Yeah, so there actually was one set of items we asked about in this survey, and I won't say it was the only area of agreement, but one that really stood out to me. We asked people about policing and crime, and specifically what some of the priorities for law enforcement should be. And that's a case where we saw a great amount of agreement. So, for example, should it be a priority for law enforcement to ensure that communities are safe? Yes, absolutely. Most Americans agree with that. But even when it gets to a little bit more controversial issues, such as whether it's important to treat suspects fairly, regardless of racial or ethnic background, there's a lot of agreement that that should be a priority for American law enforcement. Or whether it's important to maintain respect for law enforcement. There is a partisan divide there. Trump supporters are a bit more likely than Biden supporters to say that this should be a priority. But overall, Americans think that this is important, and that's an area where there's some agreement.
And I think I noted there was also wide agreement on mental health. It seems like
Mhm.
people broadly agree that discussions of mental health issues, mental health conditions, is a good thing for society. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. People seem to think that that's something that is better for society than when these issues were less discussed. And so the specific thing that we asked about is mental health and mental well-being, which can cover a lot of ground, I think. People aren't necessarily all thinking of the exact same conversations when we ask about that, but there's a very general belief that that's something that's beneficial to society.
So, as you look across these issues where there's agreement, like mental health and policing, and even areas where there's disagreement, like racial attitudes and abortion and the ones we've discussed, what do you think the message to, I'll start with our presumptive presidential candidates. What is the message to Trump and Biden on these issues and how they should shape their messaging?
I don't think that there's necessarily one single message that tells the candidates what they should focus on or what they shouldn't focus on. What I do think this report does is show the wide variety of issues that are important to Americans as we approach the election. All of these issues are, of course, contentious. Well, not all of them. We identified some areas of agreement. Many of these issues are contentious issues, and they're issues where Americans don't necessarily agree. So from the perspective of the candidates, of course, they could say, oh, well, I'm well within what my base wants when I advocate for this policy. But it also helps to paint a picture, I think, of where the average voter stands and where there might be some areas of agreement, where there might be some areas where the candidates could potentially come to some common ground. Um, but ultimately, this isn't about messaging. This report isn't about messaging. It's not about what the best way to win voters is. It's about where the voters stand and what ground they're on currently.
So, what's your prevailing message about where voters stand and what ground they're on currently? What should our audience, what should policymakers, even maybe corporate leaders take away from this?
So it's almost become, conventional wisdom to say that Americans are divided, that there's a lot of political polarization today. But I think that this report helps to show that beyond just the cliche, beyond just the simple matter of divisions. I think this report helps to show where there are specific divides, where people have strongly held beliefs that conflict with each other, and they help to show us which directions the country could potentially go in, depending on which presidential candidate wins and whose supporters get the victory in the election.